The first letter from Jake arrived 8 days after Sarah returned to Denver. She found it waiting in her mailbox when she came home from work, and the sight of the Wyoming postmark made her heart race in a way she had almost forgotten was possible. His handwriting was strong and clear, practical letters formed by hands more accustomed to handling rope and tools than pens. But there was something undeniably masculine and appealing about the way he wrote her name across the envelope. Jake's letter was everything Sarah had hoped for and nothing like what she had expected. Where her own letters had been flowing streams of consciousness, full of observations and reflections and questions, his was spare and direct, each word chosen carefully and used precisely. He thanked her for coming to Wyoming, told her about the blizzard that had hit the ranch 2 days after she left, and described the way her visit had changed something in the rhythm of his days. But it was the last paragraph of his letter that made Sarah read the whole thing 3 times. I keep finding myself thinking about the way you looked at my world, not like a tourist trying to understand something foreign, but like someone coming home to a place they had been dreaming about. It made me see my ranch through fresh eyes, and it made me realize how much I had stopped noticing the things that used to bring me joy. Thank you for that gift. Sarah carried that letter with her for days, reading it during coffee breaks at work and before bed each night. She wrote back immediately, a long letter full of her own observations about returning to city life after her Wyoming adventure. She told Jake about how different her office felt after working with her hands on his ranch, how the sounds of traffic and construction seemed harsh after the quiet rhythms of ranch life, and how she had started paying attention to the sky in a way she never had before, wondering what the weather was like in his part of the world. Thus began a correspondence that was completely different from Sarah's months of one-sided letter writing. Jake might not write as frequently as she did, but his letters were thoughtful and revealing, offering glimpses into a mind that was both practical and surprisingly poetic. He wrote about the changing seasons on the ranch, about the personalities of his animals, and about the satisfaction he found in work that connected him directly to the land and the weather. Spring arrived early in Wyoming that year, and Jake's letters began to reflect the optimism that came with longer days and the promise of new grass. He wrote about preparing for calving season, about fixing fence and repairing equipment, and about the way the first meadowlarks sounded when they returned from their winter migration. His descriptions were so vivid that Sarah could almost smell the sage and feel the warmth of the spring sun on her face. Sarah's own letters reflected her growing restlessness with her life in Denver. She had returned to work and tried to slip back into her old routines, but everything felt different now. Her friends noticed the change in her, the way she seemed distracted during conversations, and the frequency with which she checked her phone for messages. Or Sarah returned to Jake's ranch the next morning carrying a thermos of coffee from the diner in town and a bag of Danish pastries she hoped he would enjoy. The Wyoming morning was crystal clear and brutally cold, the kind of weather that made every breath visible and turned the snow into a surface that crunched underfoot like broken glass. She found Jake in the barn, feeding his horses, moving with the efficient grace of someone who had been doing these chores for decades. He looked up when she entered, and his smile was warmer than it had been the day before, as if their previous afternoon together had given him permission to be more open. He introduced her to each of his horses by name, telling her their personalities and histories as if they were family members. There was Buck, an aging quarter horse who had been his wife's favorite, and Sage, a young mare he was training for ranch work. The way Jake talked to the animals, with a combination of affection and respect, told Sarah volumes about the kind of man he was. After the morning chores, Jake suggested they drive out to check on the cattle in his far pasture. Sarah climbed into his battered pickup truck, breathing in the mixture of leather, hay, and winter air that seemed to be the signature scent of ranch life. As they bounced along the ranch roads, Jake told her more about his operation. He ran about 200 head of cattle on his 1,000-acre spread, moving them between pastures according to the season and the condition of the grass. The work was hard, and the profit margins were thin, but Jake spoke about it with the quiet pride of someone who understood his place in the world. He explained how his grandfather had started the ranch in the 1940s, how his father had expanded it in the 1970s, and how Jake himself had taken it over when his parents retired to town. The ranch was his legacy and his responsibility, a trust that connected him to both the past and the future. When they reached the cattle, scattered across a hillside dotted with sagebrush and juniper, Sarah watched Jake move among the animals with the easy confidence of someone who understood their behavior and their needs. He pointed out which cows were expecting calves in the spring, which ones were getting old and might need to be sold, and which young bulls showed promise for breeding. The cattle knew him too, moving closer when he called, accepting his presence as a natural part of their environment. Standing in the vast Wyoming landscape, surrounded by the sounds of cattle lowing and wind moving through the brush, Sarah felt something shift inside her. This was a completely different world from her orderly office life in Denver, but it felt surprisingly right. The scale of the land and the directness of the work appealed to something she had not known existed in herself. Jake seemed to sense her appreciation for his world. He began pointing out details of the landscape that only someone who lived there would notice. The way the grass grew differently on south-facing slopes, the hidden springs that provided water for wildlife, the ancient Native American petroglyphs carved into a sandstone outcropping near the creek. He shared this knowledge not to impress her, but because he could see that she was genuinely interested in understanding his environment. That afternoon, they returned to the house, and Sarah helped Jake with simple tasks around the ranch headquarters. She learned to throw hay to the horses, to check water levels in the stock tanks, and to recognize the signs that indicated whether the animals were healthy and content. The physical work felt good after months of sedentary office life, and she found herself enjoying the direct connection between effort and result that characterized ranch work. As evening approached, Jake invited Sarah to stay for dinner. He was not an elaborate cook, but he prepared a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread that tasted better than any restaurant food Sarah could remember. They ate by the warmth of his wood stove, talking about everything and nothing while the wind howled around the house. Jake told her more about his wife, Linda, and how they had met at a county fair when they were both teenagers. Their marriage had been built on shared values and complementary strengths, with Linda handling the business side of the ranch while Jake focused on the livestock and land management. Her death in a winter car accident had left Jake not only emotionally devastated, but practically overwhelmed by responsibilities he had never had to handle alone. Sarah found herself sharing more about her own marriage and divorce, explaining how her ex-husband's ambition and her own need for security had gradually pulled them in different directions until they were living parallel lives that rarely intersected. The divorce had been civil but sad, the end of something that had once held promise but had never quite fulfilled its potential. As the evening progressed, Sarah realized that she and Jake were experiencing something rare, a conversation that seemed to have no bottom, where each topic led naturally to the next, and where silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. This was the connection she had been reaching toward in her letters, the sense of being truly heard and understood by another person. When Jake offered to let her stay in his guest room rather than drive back to town in the dark, Sarah accepted without hesitation. The guest room was simple but comfortable, with a view of the ranch yard where security lights created pools of yellow illumination in the winter darkness. Sarah lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of a working ranch settling down for the night, and thinking about how different her life could be. The next morning, Sarah's last full day in Wyoming, dawned clear and even colder than before. Jake suggested they take a longer ride to see more of his ranch and some of the neighboring country. They saddled 2 horses and rode out across the frozen landscape, their breath and the horse's breath creating clouds of vapor in the frigid air. Sarah had not ridden a horse since childhood, but Jake chose a gentle, steady mount for her and gave her careful instruction in handling the animal. As they rode through the sagebrush country, following cattle trails and ranch roads, Sarah began to understand the appeal of seeing the world from horseback. The elevation gave her a better view of the landscape, and the horse's movement created a rhythm that was both soothing and energizing. Jake showed her the boundaries of his property, marked by fence lines that seemed to stretch to the horizon. He explained the complex relationships between neighboring ranchers, the informal agreements about water rights and cattle drift, the shared responsibilities for maintaining roads and fighting prairie fires. Ranch life, Sarah realized, was not the solitary existence she had imagined, but rather a complex web of interdependent relationships based on mutual respect and practical necessity. They stopped for lunch at a line shack, a small cabin that Jake used during roundup season when he needed to work cattle in the far corners of his property. Inside the simple structure, warmed by a small wood stove, Jake showed Sarah his grandfather's old brand records and explained the history of cattle ranching in the area. The documents were a fascinating glimpse into a world where a man's reputation and his success were literally branded on the animals he owned. As they prepared to head back to the ranch headquarters, Jake mentioned that there was one more place he wanted to show Sarah, a spot that had special meaning for him and Linda. They rode to the top of a ridge that commanded a view of the entire ranch and much of the surrounding country. Here, Jake explained, he and Linda used to come when they needed to talk through important decisions or simply to remind themselves of the beauty of the life they had chosen. Standing on that ridge, looking out over the vast Wyoming landscape under an endless blue sky, Sarah understood something about Jake that had been implicit in all their conversations, but never directly stated. This land was not just his livelihood, but his identity, the source of his strength and his peace. Any woman who wanted to share his life would have to understand and embrace that connection. That evening, their last together before Sarah had to return to Denver, they sat by the fire and talked about the future. Sarah had extended her vacation as long as possible, but she had responsibilities waiting for her back home. Jake had his own commitments to the ranch and to the cattle that depended on him. Neither of them wanted to rush into decisions that could change both their lives, but neither could deny that something significant had happened during their 3 days together. Jake asked Sarah if she would continue writing to him, but this time with the expectation of receiving replies. He wanted to maintain the connection they had discovered, to explore the possibility of building something together despite the distance and the differences in their lives. Sarah agreed eagerly, realizing that their correspondence could now be a true dialogue rather than a one-sided conversation. They also made tentative plans for future visits. Jake suggested that Sarah might consider coming back in the spring to see the ranch during calving season, when the harsh winter landscape would be transformed by new grass and new life. Sarah proposed that Jake might visit her in Denver to see her world and understand the life she would be leaving behind if their relationship continued to develop. As Sarah prepared to leave the next morning, she and Jake stood by her car in the ranch yard, neither wanting to say goodbye. The 3 days had passed like a dream, but the feelings they had generated were startlingly real. Sarah realized that she was no longer the same person who had driven to Wyoming on an impulse, chasing a connection she had imagined through months of unanswered letters. Jake walked around to the driver's side of her car and leaned down to speak through the open window. He thanked her for making the journey to find him, for persisting through months of silence, and for bringing something back into his life that he had thought was gone forever. Then, he did something that surprised them both. He leaned in and kissed her gently, a kiss that held both promise and uncertainty, hope, and the awareness that they were standing at the beginning of something that could change both their lives. As Sarah drove away from the ranch, she could see Jake in her rearview mirror, standing in the ranch yard with his hands in his pockets, watching her leave. The image burned itself into her memory, along with everything else about their 3 days together. She knew that she was driving back to her old life, but she also knew that she was carrying something new with her, something that would make it impossible to ever be quite the same person again. The drive back to Denver gave Sarah time to process what had happened and to begin planning what might happen next. She thought about Jake's hands, calloused from years of ranch work, but gentle when he touched her face. She thought about his laugh, rare but warm when it came. She thought about the way he moved through his world with quiet confidence, never wasting motion or words but always present and engaged with what he was doing. Most of all, she thought about the feeling of rightness she had experienced on his ranch, the sense that this harsh, beautiful landscape and the life it demanded might be exactly what she had been looking for without knowing it. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. But she knew that she would never forgive herself if she didn't explore the possibility that her strange letter-writing journey had led her exactly where she needed to be. The drive from Denver to Cheyenne should have taken less than 2 hours, but Sarah found herself stopping every few miles to take pictures or simply to stand beside her car and breathe the vast Wyoming air. She had left Denver on a crisp morning in late December, telling herself this was just a holiday road trip, a chance to see new country and clear her head. But deep down, she knew she was making a pilgrimage to a place that had existed in her imagination for 9 months, built from her own words and her vision of the life Jake Harrison might be living. Wyoming in winter was both harsher and more beautiful than she had imagined. The landscape stretched endlessly under a pale blue sky, broken only by the dark lines of fence posts and the occasional cluster of buildings that marked a ranch headquarters. The wind was constant and fierce, rocking her small sedan whenever she stopped. This was ranching country, built for people who understood how to live with space and weather and solitude. Sarah had booked a room at a small motel in Cheyenne, planning to spend 3 days exploring the area. She had printed out maps showing the locations of the 3 ranches where she had been sending her letters, though she had no clear plan for what she would do if she actually found Jake Harrison. The whole enterprise seemed increasingly foolish as she drove through the empty landscape, but she had come too far to turn back now. On her first morning in Wyoming, Sarah drove out to the first ranch on her list, the Rocking H spread about 30 miles north of Cheyenne. The long gravel driveway led to a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main house that looked like it had been built in the 1940s. Several trucks were parked near a large barn, and she could see cattle in the distance, dark shapes moving slowly across the snow-covered pasture. Sarah sat in her car for 20 minutes, trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. What would she say? How do you explain to someone that you've been writing them letters for months based on finding someone else's lost mail? Finally, a man emerged from the barn and began walking toward her car. He was tall and lean, wearing a heavy coat and a cowboy hat, moving with the easy stride of someone who spent his life outdoors. The man tapped on her window, his face concerned but friendly. When Sarah rolled it down, he leaned down to speak to her, bringing with him the smell of hay and cold morning air. His name was Tom Harrison, and yes, he knew Jake Harrison, but Jake was his nephew who lived over in Laramie County, about 40 miles east. Tom had been getting some strange mail addressed to Jake, letters from someone in Denver, and he had been meaning to forward them but hadn't gotten around to it. Sarah's heart raced. After 9 months, she had finally found a connection to her mysterious correspondent. Tom invited her inside for coffee, curious about her story and why she was looking for his nephew. In the warm kitchen of the ranch house, surrounded by the evidence of a working ranch family, Sarah found herself telling the whole story to Tom and his wife, Mary. The couple listened with growing amazement as Sarah explained about finding Emma's letter and how that had led to her own correspondence with their nephew. Mary kept shaking her head and muttering about fate and the strange ways the world worked. Tom was more practical, explaining that Jake had been having trouble with his mail service lately, something about the rural route being reorganized, and that might explain why Sarah's letters hadn't been reaching him. More importantly, Tom revealed that Jake had recently gone through a difficult time. His wife had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, and he had become increasingly isolated, spending most of his time alone on his small ranch with just his cattle and horses for company. The family had been worried about him, but Jake had always been independent and stubborn, and he resisted their efforts to draw him back into the world. Mary Harrison pulled out a photo album and showed Sarah pictures of Jake at family gatherings. He was a quiet-looking man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, someone who looked comfortable in his own skin but also somehow sad. In the more recent photos, the sadness was more pronounced, and Sarah could see the weight of loss in his expression. Tom offered to call Jake and tell him about Sarah's visit, but something made her ask him not to. She explained that she wanted to deliver her story in person, to see if the connection she felt through her letters was real or just a product of her imagination. Tom and Mary exchanged a look that suggested they thought this was either the most romantic thing they had ever heard or evidence that Sarah was completely crazy. They gave her directions to Jake's ranch and made her promise to call them later to let them know how things went. Mary packed a thermos of coffee and some homemade cookies, insisting that anyone brave enough to drive to Wyoming in December to find a man she had never met deserved proper provisions for the journey. The drive to Jake Harrison's ranch took her through some of the most beautiful and desolate country Sarah had ever seen. The road wound through rolling hills covered in snow, past frozen ponds, and bare cottonwood trees. The ranches here were farther apart, each one a small kingdom carved out of the vast landscape. Some places showed signs of prosperity, with well-maintained buildings and expensive-looking equipment, while others had the weathered, barely hanging-on appearance that spoke of hard times and harder choices. Jake's ranch was somewhere in between. The buildings were old but well-maintained, and the fences looked solid and properly repaired. A modest house sat on a small rise overlooking a creek bottom, with a barn and several outbuildings scattered nearby. The whole place had the neat, organized appearance of someone who took pride in his work even when no one else was watching. Sarah parked near the house and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. This was the moment of truth, when 9 months of imagined conversation would meet reality. She had no idea what Jake Harrison would be like in person, whether he would be angry about her letters, confused, or simply indifferent. All she knew was that writing to him had changed her life, and she needed him to know that, whatever else happened. The front door opened before she could knock, and Jake Harrison stepped onto the porch. He was exactly what she had expected, and completely different at the same time. He was tall and lean like his uncle, but his movements were slower, more careful, as if he was still learning to navigate the world after his loss. His eyes were the same kind eyes from the photos, but they held a wariness that spoke of someone who had been hurt and was not eager to be hurt again. For a long moment, they looked at each other without speaking. Then, Jake said, "You must be Sarah from Denver." His voice was quiet, but warm, with the slight drawl that Sarah had tried to imagine when she was writing her letters. Sarah nodded, suddenly, unable to find words after months of writing them. Jake stepped aside and invited her in, explaining that his uncle had called to warn him she was coming. The inside of the house was clean and spare, with the sort of functional simplicity that spoke of a man living alone. But Sarah could see evidence of the woman who had lived here before: a quilt on the back of the sofa, photographs on the mantelpiece, small touches that Jake had preserved even after his wife's death. Jake made coffee, and they sat at his kitchen table, the same table where Sarah's letters had been piling up for months, unread. Jake explained that he had indeed been receiving her mail, but that his grief had made him unable to engage with the outside world in any meaningful way. He had seen the letters from Denver, had even opened a few, but had been too overwhelmed by his own emotions to respond to someone else's outreach. But something about Sarah's persistence had begun to intrigue him. Even in his darkest moments, he found himself wondering about this woman who kept writing to him month after month, sharing her thoughts and experiences with someone who never wrote back. Her letters had become a small bright spot in his difficult days, a reminder that the world beyond his ranch was still turning, still full of people who noticed sunsets and worried about their friends and found joy in small things. As they talked, Sarah realized that her intuition about Jake had been remarkably accurate. He was exactly the kind of person she had imagined: thoughtful, observant, someone who paid attention to the world around him and found meaning in simple things. He told her about his cattle, about the rhythm of ranch life, about the way the seasons shaped everything he did. He talked about his wife, Linda, and how her death had left him feeling disconnected from everything he had once enjoyed. Sarah shared her own story, explaining how finding Emma's letter had started her on a journey that had ultimately led her back to herself. She talked about her divorce, about the loneliness that had driven her to write to a stranger, and about how those letters had somehow restored her faith in the possibility of human connection. As the afternoon wore on, they walked around Jake's ranch together. He showed her the barn where he kept his horses, the pasture where his cattle weathered the winter, the creek that ran through his property and provided water for his livestock. Sarah found herself seeing the landscape through his eyes, understanding for the first time the appeal of this harsh, beautiful country and the life it demanded. Jake asked about her letters, about what had made her continue writing when he never responded. Sarah tried to explain that the writing itself had become important to her, that sharing her thoughts with him had made her more aware of her own life, and more grateful for the small experiences that made up her days. Even without his responses, she had felt connected to something larger than her own immediate concerns. As the sun began to set over the Wyoming hills, Sarah knew she would have to return to her motel soon. The winter roads could be treacherous after dark, and she didn't want to overstay her welcome on this first meeting. But something had happened during their afternoon together, some recognition that the connection she had felt through her letters was real and mutual. Jake walked her to her car, moving slowly as if reluctant to see her leave. At the last moment, he asked if she would like to come back tomorrow, perhaps to see more of the ranch and to continue their conversation. Sarah agreed immediately, her heart racing with the realization that this strange journey was just beginning. That night, in her small motel room, Sarah wrote in her journal for the first time in months. She had been so focused on her letters to Jake that she had stopped writing about her own experiences. But now she found herself recording every detail of the day, every word of their conversation, every impression of this man who had been a stranger that morning and felt like an old friend by evening. She fell asleep thinking about the way Jake's face had changed when he smiled, how the sadness in his eyes had lifted just slightly during their time together. For 9 months, she had been writing to an imaginary person, but now she had met the real Jake Harrison, and he was both everything she had hoped and someone entirely new to discover. Sarah Mitchell had never been one to believe in fate until the day she found that crumpled letter on the sidewalk outside the Denver post office. It was a windy Tuesday morning in March 2016, and she was rushing to mail her tax returns when the weathered envelope caught her eye. The address was smudged, the stamp had fallen off, and rain had made the ink run in several places, but she could still make out enough words to understand it was a love letter that had never reached its destination. The envelope was addressed to someone named Jake Harrison at a ranch outside Cheyenne, Wyoming. The return address showed it had come from a woman named Emma, somewhere in Colorado Springs. Sarah stood there on the busy sidewalk, people brushing past her, holding this piece of someone else's heartbreak in her hands. Most people would have thrown it away or handed it to a postal worker. But something about the careful handwriting and the obvious care that had gone into the letter made Sarah pause. Inside the post office, she asked the clerk if there was any way to deliver the damaged letter. The clerk, a tired-looking man with wire-rimmed glasses, barely glanced at it before shaking his head. The address was too damaged, he explained, and without proper postage, it would just end up in the dead letter office. Sarah found herself asking more questions. How many letters ended up lost? What happened to all those undelivered messages? The clerk seemed surprised by her interest, but eventually warmed to the topic. He told her that hundreds of letters went undelivered every month, often because of damaged addresses, insufficient postage, or simply because the recipients had moved. Many were bills or advertisements, but some were personal letters, love notes, or family communications that represented real emotional connections. These lost messages haunted Sarah for the rest of the day. That evening, Sarah sat in her small apartment looking at the damaged letter. She had always been a practical person, working as an accountant for a mid-sized firm, living a quiet, predictable life. She had been through a difficult divorce 2 years earlier and had largely given up on romance, focusing instead on her career and her small circle of friends. But something about this lost letter stirred something in her that she had thought was gone forever. After 3 days of carrying the letter in her purse, Sarah made a decision that would change her life. She decided to try to find Jake Harrison herself. She spent her weekend searching online directories, social media, and public records. Wyoming is a big state with a small population, but the name Jake Harrison was common enough that she found dozens of possibilities. However, when she narrowed it down to ranchers or people associated with livestock, the list became more manageable. Using her accounting skills for detective work, Sarah cross-referenced property records with online directories and eventually found 3 Jake Harrisons who owned or worked on ranches in the Cheyenne area. She had no way of knowing which one was the right person, so she made copies of the original letter and decided to send it to all three, along with a note explaining how she had found it. But as she sat down to write the accompanying note, Sarah found herself writing something entirely different. Instead of a brief explanation, she found herself telling this unknown Jake Harrison about her own life. She wrote about finding the letter, about wondering what had happened between him and Emma, and about how the experience had made her think about all the words that go unsaid in life. She wrote about her divorce, about feeling disconnected from the world, and about how a stranger's lost love letter had somehow given her hope that meaningful connections were still possible. The letter grew to 3 pages before Sarah realized what she was doing. She was pouring her heart out to a complete stranger, someone who might not even be the right person. For a moment, she considered throwing the whole thing away. This was crazy behavior, not the sort of thing a sensible accountant should be doing. But something made her continue. She sealed the letter and Emma's original note in an envelope and addressed it to the first Jake Harrison on her list. Then, she wrote 2 more copies and sent them to the other addresses. She included her return address and a simple request that if he wasn't the right Jake Harrison, perhaps he could pass the letter along to someone who might know the right person. 2 weeks passed with no response. Sarah found herself checking her mailbox obsessively, something she had never done before. She began to feel foolish about the whole enterprise and tried to put it out of her mind. But then, she found herself writing another letter to Jake Harrison, this time without any pretext about Emma's lost mail. She wrote about her day, about the changing weather, about a book she was reading. She wrote as if she were writing to a friend she hadn't seen in years. This became a pattern. Every few days, Sarah would find herself writing to Jake Harrison. She told him about her work, her thoughts on current events, her memories of growing up in small-town Kansas. She wrote about her struggles with loneliness after her divorce, and her growing sense that she had been sleepwalking through her life. The letters became a form of therapy, a way of organizing her thoughts and feelings that she had never experienced before. After a month of letters with no response, Sarah began to include small things in her envelopes. A pressed flower from her walk in the park, a newspaper clipping about a story she thought was interesting, a photo of the sunset from her apartment balcony. She knew it was silly to send these things to someone who never wrote back, but the act of sharing these small pieces of her world had become important to her in a way she couldn't quite explain. Her friends at work began to notice changes in Sarah. She seemed more engaged, more optimistic. When they asked what was different, she couldn't really explain. How do you tell people that you've been writing letters to a stranger in Wyoming for 2 months, and that it was making you feel more like yourself than you had in years? By the summer of 2016, Sarah had sent dozens of letters to Jake Harrison. She had tried all 3 addresses she had found, cycling between them in case one was more current than the others. Still, no responses came. Any reasonable person would have given up, but Sarah found that the letter writing had become an essential part of her routine. She looked forward to her evening writing time, when she would sit by her window with a cup of tea and tell Jake Harrison about her day. Sometimes she wondered if any of her letters were reaching him. Maybe he had moved, or maybe none of the Jake Harrisons she had found were the right person. Maybe he was receiving her letters, but thought she was crazy and chose not to respond. But somehow, those concerns seemed less important than the act of writing itself. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was really living, really paying attention to her world in a way that allowed her to share it with someone else, even if that someone never acknowledged her existence. The letters became more personal as the months passed. Sarah wrote about her childhood fear of thunderstorms and how she had learned to love them as an adult. She wrote about her grandmother's apple pie recipe and the way her ex-husband had never appreciated the small gestures she made to show she cared. She wrote about her dreams of travel and her fear that she was too set in her ways to ever really change her life. By autumn, Sarah had established what felt like a real relationship with this unknown Jake Harrison, even though it was entirely one-sided. She found herself thinking about what he might be doing when the season changed, wondering if he was bringing cattle down from summer pastures or preparing for the harsh Wyoming winter. She wrote about her own preparations for winter, the way she had started stocking up on books and tea and candles to make the dark months more bearable. One evening in October, As Sarah was writing her usual letter, she realized that she had been transformed by this strange ritual. The shy, withdrawn woman who had emerged from her divorce had been replaced by someone who paid attention to the world around her, who noticed beauty in small things, who felt connected to something larger than her immediate circumstances. Even though Jake Harrison had never responded to a single letter, the act of reaching out to him had somehow reached back and changed her in ways she was still discovering. As winter approached, Sarah made a decision that surprised even her. She announced to her friends that she was taking a vacation over the holidays, something she had never done since her divorce. But instead of going somewhere warm and restful, she had decided to drive to Wyoming. She couldn't fully explain why, even to herself, but she felt a powerful need to see the landscape where Jake Harrison lived, to understand the world she had been writing to for all these months. Her friends thought she had lost her mind, and maybe she had. But Sarah had learned that sometimes the most irrational decisions lead to the most important discoveries, and she was ready to discover whatever was waiting for her in Wyoming. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin not with a first meeting, but with years of silence. In a world where we expect instant replies and immediate gratification, imagine writing letter after letter to someone who never writes back. Most people would give up after a few attempts. But what happens when faith and determination meet destiny at a weathered fence line? This is the true story of Sarah Mitchell, a woman who spent 7 years writing letters to a cowboy she'd never met, and how those unanswered words eventually led to the most unexpected reunion of her life. It's a tale that proves sometimes the longest journeys lead to the most extraordinary destinations, and that some connections transcend time, distance, and even silence itself. Get ready to discover how persistence, hope, and an old fence post became the unlikely heroes of one of the most remarkable love stories ever told.